All right, let's talk about homeostasis. So for animals, there's two approaches to homeostasis. There are many things that are regulated by some kind of homeostatic mechanism besides just temperature, which is the one we always think of, but also blood pH, the pH of interstitial fluid, blood glucose, many variables are regulated. So anything that is regulated to maintain a range, that means that for that particular metric, that animal is a regulator. It uses internal control mechanisms to keep it from changing, even if it changes outside. So a good example of that would be for pH. Animals maintain a constant pH in their interstitial fluid inside cells, in spite of the fact that the pH outside the animal's body might be different from what's inside the body. So animals are regulators when it comes to that. For any particular metric, conformer would mean that the internal condition varies when the external condition varies. So most animals do not try to regulate their temperature using internal control mechanisms. Their body temperature is whatever the surroundings are. So for example, for sponges, jellyfish, flatworms, nematodes, they are conformers when it comes to body temperature. They make no effort whatsoever to regulate their body temperature. They are whatever temperature their surrounding is. So here's an example of two organisms living in the same body of water: a river otter, mammal, and a largemouth bass, which is a ray-finned fish. And the bass is not making any attempt to regulate its body temperature. It's going to be whatever temperature the surrounding water is. It might be slightly warmer if it's exerting a lot of muscular energy, because it will generate a small amount of heat. But generally, it is not using its metabolic activity to maintain a different temperature than the water around it. While the river otter is going to be an almost constant temperature except for its daily fluctuations of about 1 degree. So here's another example with blood glucose. We work very hard to keep our blood glucose within a very narrow range. The amount of glucose circulating in your blood at any given time is only about a teaspoon of glucose. So it's quite tightly regulated. So if your blood glucose goes from 60 to 120, that's a difference of less than a teaspoon of glucose total in your body. And we have two different hormones that respond to high glucose and low glucose, and a mechanism for both increasing glucose if it's too low and decreasing glucose if it's too high. And that's homeostasis. That's one of the things that we tightly regulate. We also tightly regulate our temperature, and things are triggered when our temperature is both slightly too high or too low. And that's the case for anything that's being regulated, any parameter that's being regulated, that events are triggered when it varies from the set point. So for pH, for blood glucose, for temperature, there's a set point, and if it is too high or too low, there is a response. It triggers a response. And generally, negative feedback is used to get things back into normal range. So negative feedback means that the response is going to decrease something that's happening. Positive feedback means that the response is going to increase whatever's happening. So positive feedback would be like if your body gets a little bit too hot, you would increase your metabolism and get even hotter. That would be positive feedback. And so that you can see that that would not be helpful for maintaining homeostasis. So generally, it's negative feedback. So here's a little video trying to explain negative feedback in terms of an enzymatic reaction, where the products of the reaction are going to feed back onto the initial enzyme to stop the reaction.
This simple animation illustrates the principle of negative feedback, or feedback inhibition, in the regulation of a chemical reaction sequence in a cell. The sequence involves 4 molecules, A, B, C, and D. 3 different enzymes catalyze the conversion of one molecule to the next. The final product, D, inhibits the first enzyme in the sequence. When the concentration of D rises to a certain point, the reaction shuts itself down.
So there are times when whatever the set point is changes. And one of the things that changes the set point, Lacey, stop it. You're not going outside right now. Calm down. One of the things that changes that is just our 24-hour cycle, or the circadian rhythm. So certain things change during that, the set point changes during that. Stop, I want to throw this. Stop. Our temperature varies. So even though we are endothermic and we maintain a fairly constant temperature while you're awake, that temperature goes up in the morning, reaches a peak in the afternoon, and then goes down right before you're going to go to bed, and reaches a low point while you're asleep. In fact, this decrease in core body temperature is one of the things that's essential for getting good deep sleep, which is why it's hard to sleep in a hot room. If it's too hot, it's harder to get into a deep stage of sleep because you have to cool off in order to get the best quality sleep. And then your temperature goes up again. Cortisol is sometimes called the awake hormone. It's also a stress hormone. Having enough cortisol is definitely essential. Too much cortisol is bad and will keep you from sleeping. So, for example, your cortisol rises as it gets close to the time you're going to wake up in the morning. It increases during the day, especially in the morning, which is why many people do their most productive work in the morning. And then it starts to decline afternoon. And if you are a good sleeper, your cortisol is probably at its lowest point right before you're normally going to go to bed. People who have insomnia, one of the things that they find is that either their cortisol spikes in the evening. Oh, I don't have my pointer here. Either their cortisol spikes right when they're trying to go to sleep, or their cortisol spikes in the middle of the night and wakes them up, and then they can't go back to sleep. So those are the two kinds of insomnia: people who can't get to sleep, or people who get to sleep but then wake up in the middle of the night and can't go back to sleep. And cortisol is usually to blame for that. Melatonin is another hormone that's important for sleep, although it doesn't really make you sleepy. Melatonin is secreted by the part of the brain that detects whether it's light or dark. So if you're exposed to too much light in the evening or at night, you don't produce enough melatonin, and then your brain does not get into deep enough sleep. So your melatonin should be low during the day because you don't want to sleep during the day. And then it increases as you get closer and closer to your bedtime, and it should peak a couple of hours after you fall asleep. And then it starts to decline as it gets closer to morning. But we'll talk more about that when we get to hormones. We can also adjust our set point for certain things that are regulated based on a change in environment, and this is called acclimatization. For example, there is a set point for the amount of red blood cells, and if you move to a city that's at 9,000 or 10,000 feet above sea level, you will change your set point and you will have more circulating red blood cells than you did before you move there. That's acclimatization. That's why athletes train at high altitude, to get that acclimatization, which is an advantage in endurance events. Let's talk about endothermy and ectothermy. You've probably heard those words before. Endothermy is often just called warm-blooded, and ectothermy or ectothermic animals are called cold-blooded. And we'll talk about some nuance with these terms. But in general, endothermic animals generate a lot of heat using metabolic processes, and they stay warm even if it's cold outside of their body. Ectothermic animals generally have to warm up using the environment during the day, and then they cool off at night when it's dark. They don't have enough heat generated by their metabolism to stay warm, and they're generally not insulated either. So endothermic animals tend to have body insulation. Ectothermic animals generally don't. As you notice when we dissected our frogs, frogs don't have any insulation. Their skin is very thin and highly vascularized, and they don't even have any subcutaneous fat. All the fat in their body was in these long finger-like fat bodies that were not under the skin, and in no way were going to help keep them warm. So endotherms, although they maintain a constant body temperature, which can be very advantageous, it's also very expensive. Endothermy is very energetically expensive, as we can see from this graph. So this is a graph with metabolic rate on a logarithmic scale on the y-axis here, and mass on the x-axis here. And as you can see here, for reptiles, which are in general ectothermic, they have a much slower metabolic rate than mammals of the same mass. So if we go straight up, those are organisms that are the same mass. So a reptile of the same mass as a mammal is going to have a much lower metabolic rate, which could be an advantage. If you have a low metabolic rate, that means you don't need to eat as much food. You have a lower energy need. So mammals have a higher energetic need. So do birds, and so did most dinosaurs, because of having this need to maintain an internal body temperature. And that's why endotherms tend to be insulated, because it's expensive. It's energetically expensive to maintain this warm temperature, which is why, for example, with your house, the further north people live, the more insulated their houses are. If you've ever lived in Canada or Minnesota or northern Wisconsin, you know that a lot of people have triple pane windows because it's so expensive to heat your home when it's cold outside all the time that it's worth it to have more insulation. So for organisms that allow their body temperature to vary, we call those poikilotherms. If they maintain a fairly constant body temperature, then they are homeotherms. And it's possible for there to be some variation here. So just because something is a poikilotherm doesn't mean it's an ectoderm, and just because, or an ectotherm, and just because it's a homeotherm doesn't mean that it's an endotherm, which can be a little bit confusing. So endothermic, remember, means that they use their metabolic energy to keep their body temperature higher than their surroundings. So there are poikilotherms, which allow their body temperature to vary, that do use metabolic energy to warm themselves up. And these are generally energetic animals that need to have rapid muscular responses. And so it has been discovered that some large fish, like the opah, that's what this kind of fish is, and also large tuna, maintain an internal body temperature that's warmer than the surroundings. Although they are still poikilotherms because their body temperature does go up and down based on the temperature of the water that they're in. It's also been discovered that crocodiles are endothermic poikilotherms. So they do allow their body temperature to go up and down day and night, but They are much warmer than you would expect for a reptile. They do use some of their metabolic energy to keep the inside of their bodies warm, which that's kind of a recent discovery as well. So we are endothermic homeotherms. So we use our metabolic energy to keep ourselves warm, and we also maintain a very constant body temperature. So mammals and birds are endothermic homeotherms. There are many ways that animals help to maintain a constant temperature, whether they are an endothermic or ectothermic, and these are the 4 ways here. So radiation, so this would be radiating heat from the body, for example, or absorbing radiant heat from the sun. So like this hare, this desert hare that has very vascularized ears, is going to lose heat through those vascularized ears. Evaporation is either by sweating or panting, or even getting deliberately wet, like birds do this. They'll get deliberately wet when it's really hot in order to cool by evaporation. Convection is when you lose heat to moving air or water, not by sweating. So here's a bird allowing the nice breeze to cool off their skin. The same thing happens if you or I jump in cold water. We're going to lose body heat very rapidly by convection to the cold water. Conduction is heat from a solid, or losing heat to a solid. So this lizard here lying on a sun-warmed rock is conducting heat into its body to help warm up. And usually insulation and trying to regulate heat involves the integumentary system, skin, hair, nails, which is the integumentary system. So insulation, like blubber, hair, circulatory adaptations like the hair with its vascularized ears, cooling by evaporative heat loss, sweating, panting, behavioral responses like going in the shade, facing out of the wind, and also just adjusting the amount of heat that's being produced by metabolic activity by shivering, for example. So there's several different kinds of insulation that animals use. Just the skin itself is somewhat insulating. Feathers and fur and hair are all insulating. In fact, it's thought that the dinosaurs, this is one of the pieces of evidence that dinosaurs were endotherms, because if they all had feathers and none of them could fly, why did they evolve feathers? Well, because they were endotherms, and feathers, this is the primary function of feathers in birds. You can cut the flight feathers on birds and they'll be perfectly fine as long as they're, in a cage. But if you remove their body feathers, they'll probably die because they'll become hypothermic. So feathers, the most important function of feathers is insulation for body heat. Same thing with animals. Of course, we've adapted to that by, we can put clothes on to make up for the fact that we no longer have hardly any body hair. Other animals who have lost their body hair, like marine animals, like whales, have an under skin, a subcutaneous layer of fat called blubber that is specialized to reduce the heat loss between the interior of the animal and the much colder water around it. So there are also temporary changes in the amount of heat loss due to vasodilation and constriction. So vaso means blood vessels. So vasodilation means the blood vessels expand and increase the amount of heat loss. Vasoconstriction means that the blood vessels constrict and decrease the amount of heat loss. So here's a study that was done using an infrared camera. This is the same bird in all 4 images, but the temperature is different. So this first one here is 15 degrees C, so that's pretty cold. That's a little colder than room temperature. 21 degrees Celsius, that's about the temperature of our lab room. 29 degrees, now we're getting pretty warm. 37 degrees, that's almost 100 degrees Fahrenheit. So 4 different temperatures, and notice the bird's legs. So the whole body of the bird here is covered with feathers, so you can't really see much heat loss there. But look at the bird's legs. We can't even see the bird's legs in A and B when the air temperature is rather cool. Why is that? Because this is infrared, so that measures heat. Because due to vasoconstriction, they're not really losing any heat. But look down here when it's warmer, especially when it's 37 degrees, that's pretty warm. Now the bird is actively trying to lose heat. And look how warm those legs are now. We can see them in this image, in this infrared image, because now the blood vessels are dilated. The bird is actively trying to lose heat now through part of its body that's not covered with insulating feathers. There's another method that both birds and mammals use who have to have their limbs exposed to very cold water, and that's called countercurrent exchange. This is a way of allowing either the legs in the case of birds or the fins in the case of cetaceans to be in contact with really cold water without very much insulation, without losing a lot of body heat. It's a way of allowing those limbs to stay cooler than the rest of the body. And the arteries and the veins run very close together, right next to each other. And that allows the warm arterial blood, which is coming from the core of the body and is going to be warm, it's going to be cooled by the cool venous blood that's coming from the end of the limb. And so as the arterial blood moves down, it's going to cool. And then as it heads back towards the core of the body, it's going to be warmed up again. And interestingly, cetaceans and waterfowl have the same adaptation. Have these arteries and veins right next to each other so that this countercurrent heat exchange can occur. Shark fins as well that live in cold water do this. Even some insects do this as well. Insects have a problem in that they're very, very tiny. They're ectothermic. They don't generate much interior heat because they're so small. But their flight muscles don't work very well when the temperatures are cool. You might have noticed that now, especially in the fall, in the morning especially, you might find a bee on the ground that can't fly. It's too cold. So if you find such a bee, the thing to do is to put it in the sun because they need to warm up their flight muscles before they are able to fly. And sometimes they do it by holding onto a solid object and fanning their wings as this little wasp is doing in this particular experiment here. So when the wings are cool, it can't fly, but after it flaps its wings for a while, it warms up its flight muscles. You can now see that instead of being dark blue, there's a little bit of pinkish color now in the wings. That means the wings warmed up. Now it can fly. Evaporative heat loss is important. Of course, we're as humans very familiar with evaporative heat loss by sweating, but that's also what other animals are doing when they're panting. And birds pant, birds don't sweat. But if you see birds in the summer, especially on really hot days, you'll see them sitting in the trees with their mouths open. They're cooling, they're panting. It's a sweaty horse. Horses sweat a lot too, like we do. Some animals also will deliberately get wet when they're very hot in order to take advantage of that evaporative heat loss because they don't sweat. So that's what this little robin here, getting cool in the bird bath because they don't sweat. Ectotherms do this all the time, have behavioral responses, but even endotherms do as well. You've probably even figured out for yourself, if you ever had to, as a grade school kid, stand on a cold bus stop in the winter, that if you turn your back to the wind, it's much warmer than if you're facing the wind. And you probably learned, okay, I'm just going to turn my back to the wind to stay warm. That's a behavioral response to keeping your body temperature constant. And it can work for hot weather as well. I mean, you probably also know that if you feel really hot and you're outside, find someplace shady. Go stand in the shade. It's cooler. Here's a little squirrel trying to cool off by laying on somebody's nice, cool patio. So those are all behavioral responses to the temperature. Sometimes this gets reptiles into trouble when especially in the cooler, in the spring, you especially notice this. Snakes and lizards will often go out onto the road to warm themselves up because the asphalt has got the sun shining on it and it's nice and warm. Then they get hit by a car. So you can be helpful by not running over them when you see them and instead moving them, keeping them in the sun, but move them off the road so they don't get hit. Thermogenesis, it means adjusting metabolic heat production to maintain constant internal temperature, and we do this. So if you feel cold, one of the things that happens is your body will increase its metabolic rate to try to stay warm. And this has actually been touted as a weight loss mechanism recently. I have seen people actually advocate taking cold showers or getting into a cold bath multiple times a day to try to increase your metabolic rate. I can't think of a more miserable way to lose weight. I don't even know if it works. But you can, so shivering is one way that you increase your metabolic rate, but your body will increase your metabolic rate just generally without shivering. And one of the mechanisms for that is with something called brown fat. Now, as adults, we don't have a lot of brown fat. It varies by person. Some people naturally have more than others. If you know somebody who's never cold, who no matter how cold it is in the room, everybody else is cold and they're not cold, they might be one of those people who has a lot of brown fat. Babies have a lot of brown fat because, of course, they have a much harder time staying warm because they can't move to get someplace warmer. They don't have very many behavioral responses to change to thermal regulation. So they can actually increase thermogenesis with brown fat. Brown fat is brown because it looks like ordinary adipose tissue, but it's loaded with mitochondria. And there's so many mitochondria that it actually, instead of looking yellow, which is the color most adipose tissue looks, that it looks kind of grayish or brownish because of all the mitochondria. And in babies, they have a lot of this brown fat around their neck and the upper part of their thoracic cavity. And it generally decreases or almost completely disappears by the time you're an adult. This could be one of the reasons why kids have a much higher metabolic rate than adults, is because kids still have brown fat, but after you go through puberty, then it pretty much disappears. Things also can change acclimatization to the temperature. So, for example, dogs and horses that are kept outside all the time in the winter will grow a thicker coat. That's acclimatization. For organisms that live in very cold water, and it can change from colder to warmer water, the lipid composition of their cell membrane, specifically the fatty acids, will change. And in the colder water, they're going to have more polyunsaturated fatty acids in their membranes, which will keep them more liquidy at a lower temperature. So our body temperature, where our thermostat is in the hypothalamus, and we're going to learn more about the parts of the brain when we get to the nervous system. The hypothalamus triggers sweating and triggers other mechanisms, makes you uncomfortable when you're too cold or too warm, and triggers behavioral responses. Now it can change. What your set point is can change if you're sick. Probably you all have heard of fevers, that your set point goes up when you're sick. We've all been hearing a lot about that with COVID, and we all have had our temperatures checked every time we come into the building. So why does our temperature go up when we have an infection with a bacteria or a virus? The reason is because it's actually a really good defense mechanism. Many bacteria are acutely sensitive to temperature, and just raising the temperature a few degrees makes it impossible for them to divide. And so that's a really good adaptation, which is why many doctors now say, unless you're really uncomfortable, that you shouldn't try to lower your fever right away. If you have a fever, don't immediately take medicine to lower that fever, because the fever itself is a defense mechanism. That's part of your immune system. The fever is a response that is going to inhibit viral replication and inhibit bacterial replication. And, you know, unless it's really bothering you and you're really uncomfortable or it's really high, just leave it. Let it do its job at helping fight the infection, whatever it is. So how much energy do we need? This is something that you've probably heard of if you're interested in sports medicine or exercise physiology. This is a constant topic in those fields. The field of trying to determine how much energy particular organisms use, which organ systems use the most energy, this is the field of bioenergetics. And we have ways of measuring the metabolic activity of animals, some of them more accurate, some of them less accurate. So the energy that we use, we can use carbohydrates, proteins, and fats for energy. These are all broken down in our cells, and almost all of the energy is generated by our mitochondria. Here's a little mitochondria here. If you remember from respiration, over 90% of the ATP that's used by our cells is made in the mitochondria. Stop. And the byproducts of the Krebs cycle are used for biosynthesis. So whatever we don't need for ATP, those remaining food molecules can be used for biosynthesis, for making amino acids, which can be used for proteins, for making fats or fatty acids, which can be used to make phospholipids and cholesterol. So if you remember, when sugar is broken down and pyruvate goes into the mitochondria, it's broken down into acetyl-CoA. Stop, I'm warning you. Stop it. It's broken down into acetyl-CoA, which goes into the Krebs cycle, or the citric acid cycle. And then there are these 4 and 5 carbon intermediates in the citric acid cycle. Those can come in and out of the cycle. So if you're making amino acids, for example, acetyl-CoA and some of the intermediates of the Krebs cycle can be funneled out of the mitochondria to be used to make amino acids. If you're making fatty acids for membranes, for example, acetyl-CoA is going to be used for that. So acetyl-CoA has 2 carbons, and acetyl-CoA can be shuttled off out of the mitochondria and used to synthesize fatty acids. So that's an important function of the mitochondria, which often gets overlooked. We hear about mitochondria is all about making ATP. Yeah, but it also makes really important intermediates that are used to make amino acids and fats. So here's an overall look at metabolism. So we have our molecules coming in from food, because remember, we're heterotrophs, so animals have to bring in the food, even if we're talking about coral that's getting a little bit of its energy from algae and photosynthesis. Digestion takes energy, So there is some energy that's going to be used, and there's going to be some heat lost in that process, because anytime you transform energy from one form to another, you lose some as heat. Not everything is going to be used. There's always some waste, and for us, energy lost in feces would be like fiber. So fiber is, some of it is cellulose, other polysaccharides that plants make that we don't have the ability to digest. It's all glucose, but we can't digest it, so it's just lost. So that's what that energy lost in feces means. Nutrient molecules go to the body. Some energy is lost removing nitrogenous waste. So if we're burning proteins for energy, for example, which we always do burn a little bit of protein as energy. Some of the proteins in your body are always being recycled and reused. We have to get rid of the nitrogenous waste. There's a little bit of energy in that, which we can't use. Nutrients go to the body cells, cellular respiration. That's what the mitochondria are doing. That's oxidative respiration, making most of our ATP. That goes to cellular work like muscle contraction. Some heat is going to be lost for that process. Other than what we need for ATP, metabolic intermediates are going to come out of the mitochondria. So we have G3P, glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, which is an intermediate from glycolysis. We have acetyl-CoA, which is a 2-carbon intermediate. And then we have those 3 and 4 and 5 carbon intermediates that are in the citric acid cycle. Those are all going to go to making amino acids, nucleic acids, fatty acids for everything that we need. Even we do synthesize a small amount of carbohydrate. For example, if your blood sugar is too low, your liver can make sugar from fat using these carbon intermediates by a process called gluconeogenesis, which is why even if you're not eating any sugar, your blood sugar is going to be just fine. Some heat is always lost. You notice that every step here, anytime you're converting energy from one form to another, you're going to lose heat as a byproduct. So the metabolic rate, to try to determine it, there's a couple of different ways to look at it. You can look at the amount of heat that's generated to determine metabolic rate. You can look at how much oxygen is consumed and how much carbon dioxide is produced, which is what's happening here. That's generally what we do for humans to try to figure out exactly what your metabolic rate is. That's the easier one to do for humans. Generally, for people, we're approximating it just based on your weight and height and sex, things like that. But that's just an approximation. If you want to be really exact, you got to measure how much oxygen people are using and how much carbon dioxide they're producing to figure out what their actual metabolic rate is. And this little shark here in the tank, they're probably measuring heat loss with this and measuring the change in water temperature to determine what this animal's metabolic rate is. So for endothermic animals like mammals and birds, we call their metabolic rate without any activity the basal metabolic rate. So this is your metabolic rate if you're just sitting still at a comfortable temperature. And of course, it's going to vary a little bit over 24 hours. When you're a little bit cooler at night, your basal metabolic rate is going to be a little bit lower. When you're during the day, it's going to be a little bit higher. For ectothermic animals, it varies by temperature. So we don't call it basal metabolic rate. We call it standard metabolic rate. And you have to specify the temperature, because for an ectotherm, their metabolic rate is going to be lower at a lower temperature. So you have to say metabolic rate at X temperature if you're talking about an ectotherm. And the rates would always assume that it's not currently digesting a big meal, it's not stressed, it's not a rapidly growing young animal, because of course that would have a higher metabolic rate. And what scientists have found is that ectotherms have much lower metabolic rates, which is what we already talked about, the fact that it's expensive to be an endotherm. It's energetically expensive. We would expect endotherms to have a much higher basal metabolic rate than the metabolic rate of an ectotherm, because of course they're not expending a lot of metabolic energy just to maintain a constant body temperature. Other things affected your metabolic rate changes over the course of your life. Your metabolic rate was the highest when you were a small child. Children have much higher metabolic rates. They also have slightly higher body temperatures. Kids have slightly higher average body temperatures than adults, and then the elderly have slightly lower body temperature. Sex affects it too. So men have slightly higher metabolic rate than women, and that could be related to just muscle mass, that on average men tend to have a higher muscle mass than women. The amount of your activity is going to have a difference. The greater muscle mass you have, the higher your resting metabolic rate is going to be. Muscles are energetically, what do we want to say? That muscles use energy even at rest. So if you have a large muscle mass, you're going to have a higher basal metabolic rate even at rest. And also temperature is going to affect it, because even for an endotherm living in a colder environment is going to expend more energy just maintaining body temperature. And it has also been discovered that for mammals especially, that size, body size, has an enormous effect on metabolic rate. That metabolic rate does not vary continuously with mass. That instead, small animals have a disproportionately very rapid metabolic rate. And this holds true for birds too, not just mammals. Small animals tend to have a much higher oxygen use, more rapid breathing rate, higher heart rate, greater relative blood volume compared to a larger animal. So here we have this is logarithmic scale here for both basal metabolic rate, which is per kilogram. So this is the size of the animal here is out of the picture because we have per kilogram in there. And then versus total body mass, total average body mass. And so you'll notice that the basal metabolic rate for very small animals like a mouse and a shrew is the smallest mammal. That's what that picture was. This is a shrew. They have the highest heart rate of any mammal. They do live around here. You might find them. They have an extremely high metabolic rate, which means they need to eat, relative to their body size, they need to eat an enormous amount of food. But large animals like humans, horses, elephants, I know we don't think of ourselves as large, but we're actually, for an animal, we are very large animals. Almost all animals are smaller than we are. We just focus on the large animals because we're a large animal. So we don't see things proportionally. We tend to focus on the big animals that are our size. Elephants and probably, I don't know if anybody's ever studied blue whales. Blue whales are the largest animals. And I don't know if they have the slowest metabolic rate. I don't know if anybody knows. We can't study them in captivity. I don't know if anybody has studied their metabolic rate. But I would guess that they have a relatively slow metabolic rate, although they have a considerably more difficult temperature situation than elephants do. Elephants live in warm climates and don't have a big difference between inside and outside temperatures the way that whales do. So maybe whales don't have the lowest metabolic rate, but they are the largest animals, so we would expect them to. Torpor is a way of conserving energy. It's related to hibernation. So animals that have true hibernation experience torpor. Torpor is a state of highly decreased physiological activity. So the chipmunks are going into hibernation right now. They're one of the animals around here that has true hibernation, where they are so out of it that if you dug one up in the middle of winter, you could pick them up and they would be totally unresponsive when they're in torpor. It lets them save energy when food would be difficult to find. I'm warning you. Stop that. There are animals that go through torpor every day, like hummingbirds. I have a little video about that. But true hibernation is torpor that lasts for usually at least several months, sometimes as long as 6 months. Like the longest hibernating animal that we have around here are the chipmunks. Chipmunks hibernate for 4 or 5 months around here. They're getting ready to go into hibernation now. So we talked about the 4 tissue types: epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous. And pretty much, if it's not an epithelial layer and it's not a muscle or a nerve, it's connective tissue. Connective tissue is everything else. We talked about homeostasis and how organisms maintain homeostasis. It's usually negative feedback. There's usually a set point. We talked a little bit about thermal homeostasis. So organisms are endotherms or ectotherms. Endotherm meaning they use a lot of their own metabolic energy to maintain a constant temperature. Poikilotherms allow their temperature to go up and down and vary. So most ectotherms would be, or most poikilotherms would be ectotherms, but there are some endotherms that are also poikilotherms. If they use metabolic energy to keep their body temperature higher than their surroundings, like tuna and the opah fish and crocodiles, but they do allow their body temperature to vary with their surroundings. Homeotherms maintain a constant internal temperature, pretty much, very close to a constant internal temperature. So we're homeotherms even though our temperature varies by about a full degree Celsius over the course of a 24-hour period. So we're endotherms and homeotherms, which most birds and mammals would. In fact, I can't think of an exception to that. So birds and mammals are endotherms and homeotherms. Metabolic activity can be measured, and we can measure it either by heat loss or by oxygen use and carbon dioxide production. And we differentiate, we call it basal metabolic rate for birds and mammals. We call it something else for standard metabolic rate for ectotherms. And then you have to specify the temperature because, of course, it's going to be lower at a lower temperature. Torpor and estivation are ways of conserving energy for particular times of the year, or in the case of the hummingbird, between day and night, because they can't get food at night and they do need to sleep as well. All mammals, birds, and many other animals, including even insects, have sleep-like conditions. And torpor and estivation allow animals to survive harsh conditions when they wouldn't be able to get food, either winter or a very hot, dry period if it's a desert animal. So that's the end of this chapter. So the rest of the chapters in Module 3 and 4 are going over each of the specific organ systems or a particular functionality in the body and how that works, specifically in mammals, but also comparing some of the other kind of animals that we've looked at as well. But we'll be focusing more on humans and mammals.